Circle in downtown Indianapolis. Tonight we have a program sponsored by Center for Inquiry Indiana, and we are commemorating the birthday of Robert Ingersoll. Actually, his birthday was yesterday, but we're having the program today. And the reason we are having it here at the Circle in Indianapolis is because Robert Ingersoll made one of his most famous speeches right here in Indianapolis on the Circle. And our main speaker tonight will tell you a lot more about that, then I won't spoil that for you. But Robert Ingersoll was maybe the most or one of the greatest orators in American history. Thousands of people turned out to hear him talk. He gave maybe around 100 speeches in Indiana, and he gave one of his most famous ones here. So that's why we're here tonight, to commemorate Robert Ingersoll's birthday and to remember the great speech that he gave here, right here in Indianapolis. Our guest speaker tonight is Tom Flynn. Tom is with our international organization, Center for Inquiry, headquartered in Buffalo, New York. He is the editor of our major magazine, Green Ingersoll. He is the executive director of Council for Secular Humanism, and he is the director of the Robert Ingersoll Museum, which is in Dresden, New York. So Tom is our expert on Robert Ingersoll. He will be speaking and reading parts from the speech that Ingersoll gave here, and then people who have signed up with me to read quotes after Tom's speech may come to the mic after he finishes. If you didn't sign up, but you'd still like to read something from Ingersoll, come up and talk to me after the speech, okay? I will give you Tom Flynn.
Thank you, Reba. Thanks very much. Thank you for coming out, and it's great to be here on Monument Circle. I'm here to speak to you tonight about Robert Green Ingersoll, one of the most remarkable Americans that most people never heard of. In his life, he was anything but obscure. He was a famous attorney. He was the most successful public lecturer in American history, the leading political speechmaker for the Republican Party. Yes, you heard that right. And an outspoken atheist and agnostic. He was one of the most prominent Americans of the Gilded Age. And Ingersoll, as Reba has mentioned, had significant ties to Indianapolis and central Indiana. Now, nearby in Crawfordsville is the home of Lew Wallace, the son of a governor of Indiana, himself governor of the New Mexico Territory. Wallace accomplished many things, but he's best known for writing Ben-Hur, the melodramatic 19th century bestseller that inspired the classic film starring Charlton Heston. Believe it or not, there's an intimate link between Lew Wallace, Ben-Hur, and Robert Ingersoll. During his life and after his death, Ingersoll influenced one of central Indiana's local legends, Carl Graham Fisher. Fisher built the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He inaugurated the Indy 500. He built Miami Beach out of a mangrove swamp, and he died broke. Believe it or not, there's an intimate link between Carl Graham Fisher and Robert Green Ingersoll. And in Indianapolis, indeed on this very circle, Ingersoll gave one of his most influential addresses, a speech that was considered second only to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address as a commentary on the Civil War. Today, this speech, like its author, is all but forgotten. I will share the stories of each of Ingersoll's Indiana legacies, but first, a little more about the man himself. The fact that Robert Ingersoll rose to become one of the best known of all Americans, in spite of the fact that he was an explicit atheist and agnostic, attests to the incomparable qualities of this most extraordinary individual. The fact that he is all but forgotten today attests to the power of religious intolerance to scour even an extraordinary individual out of the historical record. Born in 1833 in New York State, Ingersoll entered public life as a Peoria, Illinois attorney. Following distinguished service in the Civil War, he was appointed to be the first Attorney General of Illinois. It would be the first and last public office he would hold. Ingersoll allied himself politically with the Republicans. And if you didn't know this before, by the time I'm done, you're going to learn tonight that party labels have shifted something fierce over the years. The Republicans of Ingersoll's time were the party of Lincoln, and in those days the voice of progress and reform. Ingersoll's electrifying speaking voice soon made him the most sought-after speechmaker on behalf of Republican candidates and causes. Now, Ingersoll's views on religion placed elective office beyond his reach, but he campaigned on behalf of every Republican presidential candidate but one, from Grant to McKinley, and they all won. During Ingersoll's public years, the only Republican to lose a presidential bid was the Senator James G. Blaine, and he was the only Republican Party nominee whom Ingersoll had declined to support. So it's probably exaggerating a little, but it's strictly speaking true. The Republicans couldn't put a man in the White House without Bob Ingersoll. Ingersoll's legal career was prosperous and distinguished. He mounted a successful defense of two men who'd been falsely accused in the Star Root scandal, perhaps the most controversial and politically charged trial of the late 19th century. But it was Ingersoll's private speaking career that made his name a household word. Ingersoll toured relentlessly. He crisscrossed the country for more than 30 years. On more than 1,500 occasions, he lectured to capacity crowds, always from memory, usually for 3 or 4 hours straight. No public address system, no notes, no props, just his voice, his wit, and maybe a glass of water. Of course, motorcycles were quieter then. His topics ranged from Shakespeare to Reconstruction, from science to religion. Ingersoll gave no fewer than 103 of those speeches in the state of Indiana. Ingersoll's lectures packed theaters, exhibition halls, and open-air venues everywhere he went. The best seats at his theatrical engagements cost $1 per person, an astronomical admission price by the standards of the day. His speaking fees for a paid lecture ranged as high as $7,000, back when that was real money. Many who heard Ingersoll disagreed with everything he said. Many who heard him detested his philosophy. But no one denied that Ingersoll possessed a gift for oratory like no one else alive. And even the people who hated him would pay top dollar to hear the music that was his voice. Ingersoll's friends included presidents, literary giants like Mark Twain, captains of industry like Andrew Carnegie, radical reformers like socialist Eugene Debs. What kind of a man did he have to be that people so disparate, so opposed to one another in many ways, would all call him their friend? He was befriended by leading figures in the arts and also by reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass. So now, let's turn to Ingersoll's Indiana legacies. In 1876, Lew Wallace, Civil War general and future governor of the New Mexico Territory, he lived in Crawfordsville, northwest of here. Up to this point in his life, Wallace had been apathetic in matters of religion. But for years, he had toyed with the idea of writing a story about the book of Jesus. In 1876, probably on September 16th of that year, Wallace traveled by train to attend a regional Republican convention in Indianapolis. Ingersoll spotted Wallace walking through the car and invited him into his compartment. And on impulse, Wallace engaged the great agnostic, as Ingersoll was known, on the subject of religion. Here's how Wallace recounts the beginning of the conversation. Wallace asked, "Is there a God?" Quick as a flash, Ingersoll replied, "I don't know. Do you?" Wallace asked, "Is there a devil?" Answered Ingersoll, "I don't know. Do you?" "Is there a heaven?" "I don't know. Do you?" Wallace reports that Ingersoll then launched into an astonishing 2-hour recitation of the case against believing in God, Christianity, and the doctrine of eternal rewards and punishments. Ingersoll's declamation shook Wallace to his core, but its effect would be the opposite of what Ingersoll intended. After reflecting for some days on this encounter, Wallace became convinced of the truth and importance of Christianity as never before. On fire with his faith, Wallace resolved to chronicle not just the birth of Jesus, but his life and death as well. Now, how to present all that in a fresh way? Well, why not weave the familiar story of Jesus into the melodramatic tale of a Jewish aristocrat who is disgraced, who redeems himself by feats of war and sportsmanship, but ultimately, after several faithful encounters with Jesus during his public ministry, becomes a follower of Christ. And that was the story of Ben-Hur. Published in 1880, Ben-Hur became the #1 best-selling book of the entire 19th century. It went through some 400 editions. An 1899 adaptation on Broadway ran for more than 6,000 performances and was seen by more than 20 million people. Ben-Hur was filmed twice, as a silent movie in 1925 and as a widescreen spectacular in 1959. The Wallace residence in Crawfordsville is now a museum that's mostly about Ben-Hur. For better or worse, we owe the Ben-Hur phenomenon, including the lengthy stardom of Charlton Heston, to Ingersoll. Ingersoll's second great Indiana legacy connects to Carl Graham Fisher. Born into a broken home in 1874, Fisher had no patience for school, in part because he was extremely nearsighted. Starting at age 12, he supported himself as a butcher. No, not a meat cutter. These butchers were young men who worked for the railroads. They would thread their way up the aisles of the passenger cars, selling magazines, pocket-sized books, cigars, and snack items. 12 was too young to be a butcher, but Fisher didn't let that stop him. Young Carl turned out to be a shrewd judge of people and a redoubtable salesman. Among his most popular products were slender booklets, each reproducing the text of some Ingersoll speech, like Some Mistakes of Moses or The Gods. Carl Graham Fisher sold more Ingersoll booklets than anyone, literally. He won a national prize from Ingersoll's publisher for selling more Ingersoll booklets on trains than any other butcher on any railroad in America. During his breaks, Fisher would sit down on the floor of a rail car, munch some peanuts, and read Ingersoll. One of Ingersoll's best-loved aphorisms became the guiding principle of Fisher's young life. The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make others so. Now that sounds mild today, but in post-Civil War America, that was subversive on several levels. Its emphasis on the here and now devalued the afterlife. And it simply assumed that the highest goal of human existence was to be happy. Bold thinking in an age that prized stoicism, duty, thrift, and deferred gratification. Fisher accepted the idea that happiness in the here and now was a worthy goal, and he would spend the rest of his life applying his understanding of people and his salesmanship in a series of dazzling projects designed to help people find happiness. He sold bicycles, then automobiles. Here in Indianapolis, he opened what is generally considered the nation's first car dealership. To promote the automobile and to encourage experimentation to make cars more reliable, he built the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 1909 and created the Indy 500 in 1911. To open the nation to motoring, he promoted an unprecedented New York to San Francisco thoroughfare, the Lincoln Highway, which later became the corridor for Interstate 80. Now, Fisher was never one to think small. His crowning achievement was to develop Miami Beach, on land he literally reclaimed out of a mangrove swamp. Today we'd say he despoiled wetlands, but those were more innocent times. Miami Beach made him rich beyond measure. He lived in an elegant oceanfront apartment. In his library was a 12-volume leather-bound set of the collected works of Robert Green Ingersoll. Sadly, Fisher didn't follow the whole of Ingersoll's example. Where Ingersoll was a model husband and family man, Fisher was an inveterate philanderer. Where Ingersoll enjoyed wine in moderation, Fisher drank whiskey with an enthusiasm that destroyed his health. But ultimately, it was Fisher's ambition that would be his undoing. At the very dawn of the Depression, he staked his whole fortune on creating a Miami of the North at Montauk, on the easternmost tip of Long Island. The project failed and it ruined him. Broken, disgraced, Fisher drank himself to death in 1939. His time to be happy had passed. Ingersoll's third Indiana legacy is rooted on this very spot. On September 20th, 1876, a crowd of 10,000 gathered here on Monument Circle to hear Ingersoll lecture to a Civil War veterans group. They didn't know it, but what they were about to hear would become one of Ingersoll's defining speeches. Now, the lecture began on a stolidly political note. In the years after the Civil War, Republicans gloried in being the party of Lincoln, the party that had taken a hard line toward the rebellious South. Fairly or not, the Democrats were seen as the party that had tolerated Southern slavery and sedition, the party that opposed the war, the party that betrayed freed African Americans and Civil War veterans to boot. Ingersoll was one of the inventors of a political style called waving the bloody shirt. Sure, you've all heard that phrase. You probably didn't know that Ingersoll coined it. Now, waving the bloody shirt was a technique of rhetoric for using the horrors of the Civil War as a weapon against Democrats. This strategy remained effective for as long as the war veterans formed a powerful voting bloc, which is to say throughout the 19th century. Now, just as an example of how over-the-top 19th century political rhetoric could get, I'm quoting now, here's how Robert Ingersoll opened his Monument Circle speech. I am opposed to the Democratic Party, and I will tell you why. Every state that seceded from the United States was a Democratic state. Every ordinance of secession that was drawn by a Democrat. Every man that endeavored to tear the old flag from the heaven it enriches was a Democrat. Every man that tried to destroy this nation was a Democrat. Now, Ingersoll's just getting warmed up. Every man that loved slavery better than liberty was a Democrat. The man that assassinated Abraham Lincoln was a Democrat. Every man that sympathized with the assassin, every man glad that the noblest president ever elected was assassinated, was a Democrat. Every man that wanted the privilege of whipping another man to make him work for him for nothing and pay him with lashes on his naked back was a Democrat. Every man that raised bloodhounds to pursue human beings was a Democrat. I think we're starting to get the idea. But that's not the reason we're gathered here today to remember this speech. You see, fortunately, about 20 minutes after all of that partisan bombast, Ingersoll let fly with a glorious train of words that was rich in the sentiments that had moved the nation as it lived through war. The 768-word passage became known as A Vision of War. It was reprinted dozens of times. It became the speech Ingersoll had to give on Memorial Day for the rest of his life. And now, a vision of war. The past rises before me like a dream. Again, we are in the great struggle for national life. We hear the sounds of preparation, the music of boisterous drums, the silver voices of heroic bugles. We see thousands of assemblages and hear the appeals of orators. We see the pale cheeks of women and the flushed faces of men. And in those assemblages, we see all the dead, whose dust we have covered with flowers. We lose sight of them no more. We are with them when they enlist in the great army of freedom. We see them part with those they love. Some are walking for the last time in quiet, woody places with the maidens they adore. We hear the whisperings and the sweet vows of eternal love as they lingeringly part forever. Others are bending over cradles, kissing babes that are asleep. Some are receiving the blessings of old men. Some are parting with mothers who hold them and press them to their hearts again and again and say nothing. Kisses and tears, tears and kisses, to find mingling of agony and love. And some are talking with wives and endeavoring with brave words spoken in the old tones to drive from their hearts the awful fear. We see them part. We see the wife standing in the door with the babe in her arms, standing in the sunlight, sobbing. At the turn of the road, a hand waves. She answers by holding high in her loving arms the child. He is gone. and forever. We see them all as they march proudly away under the flaunting flags, keeping time to the grand, wild music of war, marching down the streets of the great cities, through the towns and across the prairies, down to the fields of glory, to do and die for the eternal right. We go with them, one and all. We are by their side on all the gory fields, in all the hospitals of pain, on all the weary marches. We stand guard with them in the wild storm and under the quiet stars. We are with them in ravines running with blood, in the furrows of the old fields. We are with them between contending hosts, unable to move, wild with thirst, the life ebbing slowly away among the withered leaves. We see them pierced by balls and torn with shells, in the trenches, by forts, and in the whirlwind of the charge where men become iron with nerves of steel. We are with them in the prisons of hatred and famine, but human speech can never tell what they endured. We are at home when the news comes that they are dead. We see the maiden in the shadow of her first sorrow. We see the silvered head of the old man bowed with the last grief. The past rises before us, and we see 4 millions of human beings governed by the lash. We see them bound hand and foot. We hear the strokes of cruel whips. We see the hounds tracking women through tangled swamps. We see babes sold from the breasts of mothers. Cruelty unspeakable. Outrage infinite. 4 million bodies in chains, 4 million souls in fetters. All the sacred relations of wife and mother and father and child trampled beneath the brutal feet of might. And all this was done under our own beautiful banner of the free. The past rises before us. We hear the roar and shriek of the bursting shell. The broken fetters fall. These heroes died. We look. Instead of slaves, we see men and women and children. The wand of progress touches the auction block, the slave pen, the whipping post, and we see homes and firesides and schoolhouses and books. And where all was want and crime and cruelty and fear, we see the faces of the free. These heroes are dead. They died for liberty. They died for us. They are at rest. They sleep in the land they made free. Under the flag they rendered stainless. Under the solemn pines, the sad hemlocks, the tearful willows, and the embracing vines. They sleep beneath the shadows of the clouds, careless alike of sunshine or of storm, each in the windowless palace of rest. The earth may run red with other wars, they are at peace. In the midst of battle, in the roar of conflict, they found the serenity of death. I have one sentiment for all soldiers, living and dead. Cheers for the living, tears for the dead. A Vision of War by Robert Green Ingersoll. Hey, I only read it. Bob did the hard part. It's easy to see why this oration and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address were long considered the defining commentaries on the Civil War. And indeed, not until Stephen Crane published The Red Badge of Courage in 1895 would Ingersoll's speech be displaced from the national pantheon. Well, Ingersoll returned to Indianapolis many times, but never to such effect as his 1876 speech here at Monument Circle. The speech that gave the world a vision of war. Ingersoll died in Dobbs Ferry, New York, in July of 1899, surrounded by the members of his family. From my perspective, Ingersoll wasn't wrong about many things, but I have to be honest with you, his last words were, "I am feeling better now." Ingersoll remained famous for several decades. A lavish 12-volume set of his collected works went through a dozen printings between 1900 and 1929. Ingersoll's words are stirring on the page, but his contemporaries agreed that reading them paled compared to the astounding experience of hearing them delivered by Ingersoll himself. As the people who had known that privilege died out, the forces of religious bigotry could set about erasing Ingersoll's memory. They almost succeeded. It is long past time that mainstream America rediscover this Renaissance man of oratory who played so large a role in the Gilded Age and is so unfairly forgotten today. It is long past time that traditionally religious Americans recognize that religious dissent and even disbelief have always been an important thread in the fabric of American life. Non-religious and anti-religious Americans played important roles in our national history and ought not to be concealed. And I'm proud to announce that this December there's going to be a giant step taken to restore Ingersoll to the prominence he deserves. In December of this year, the historian Susan Jacoby will publish a new autobiography of Ingersoll, the sixth that I expect most scholarly. Susan's books get reviewed, they get attention, and so Ingersoll's going to be the most remarkable man that this December quite a few more people will finally have heard of. So Robert Green Ingersoll and the great state of Indiana share rich legacies, and it has been my pleasure to remember them with you this evening. Thank you very much.